She did not walk into punk as a singer. She walked in like a threat. At 19, she stepped on stage with Sid Vicious on drums, a bass player who barely knew the instrument, and no real songs at all. 20 minutes of the Lord's Prayer screamed over feedback should have ended as a joke. Instead, it became a warning. 2 years later, her debut single hit number 7 in Britain. Robert Smith of The Cure stepped into her world not once, but twice. Joy Division heard what her band was doing and changed direction. The Smiths, Radiohead, and half of alternative rock would later carry pieces of her shadow. But joining the Banshees was not like joining a band. It was like stepping into a machine that kept spitting musicians back out. Guitarists vanished, drummers fled, one future legend burned out, one genius collapsed in Madrid, and after 11 albums, even the label that signed her finally walked away. The dates are real. The chart numbers are real. The wreckage is real. This is the story of Siouxsie Sioux, the woman who helped shape the darker side of post-punk and goth music, then learned the hard way that a band can survive drugs, bad labels, and bad luck, but not one person needing total control. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Learned to Make People Stare. Siouxsie Sue was born Susan Janet Ballion on May 27, 1957, in Southwark, London. She grew up in the suburbs of Kent, far from the music scene that would later make her famous. As a teenager, she suffered from ulcerative colitis and spent time recovering in hospital. Around that period, she saw David Bowie perform on Top of the Pops, and his image made a strong impression on her. Bowie looked like someone who had invented himself completely, and for Susan Ballion, that mattered. By her late teens, she was moving through London's gay clubs, punk circles, and was in the group later called the Bromley Contingent. Most of its members were not even musicians. They were watchers, dressers, provocateurs. Kids turning style into a weapon, and Siouxsie was better at it than almost anyone around her. The hair, the stare, the makeup, the clothes, the cold way she carried herself. It was not decoration, it was control. Before she had a band, she already knew how to make a room react. That is the first thing to understand about her. Siouxsie did not enter music hoping people would like her. She entered already knowing how to make them nervous. And once she realized that was power, she walked onto a stage with no songs at all. Chapter 2. The Night She Turned Nothing into a Threat. September 20th, 1976. London's 100 Club Punk Festival. Siouxsie was 19 when she stepped on stage with Stephen Severin on bass, Marco Pirroni on guitar, and Sid Vicious on drums. Yes, that's Sid Vicious. The future Sex Pistols disaster story was sitting behind the kit before the world knew what he would become. The Banshees were barely a band. No catalog, no polished set, no proper plan. Severin had only just picked up the bass. Sid was not there to keep anything steady. Most singers would have panicked, because there was almost nothing to hide behind. Siouxsie did the opposite. She made the emptiness the act. They performed the Lord's Prayer as a long, ugly blast of noise. Feedback, drums, scripture, screaming, and 20 minutes of nerve. It should have been a joke. It should have collapsed into one of those punk stories people laugh about once, then forget. But Siouxsie stood inside the mess like she owned it. That was her gift and her danger. She could take something unfinished and make people believe it was intentional. She could turn lack of skill into atmosphere and chaos into command. The crowd heard more than noise. They heard someone refusing to apologize for having no permission. So the one-off stunt became a band. And from the very beginning, Siouxsie's lesson was brutal. You did not need normal musicians if you could control the feeling in the room. But real bands need real players. That was when people started getting thrown into her world. Chapter 3. The hit that proved she was right. Once the Banshees became a real band, the lineup settled around Siouxsie, Stephen Severin, guitarist John McGeoch, and drummer Kenny Morris. For a brief moment, this version worked almost too well. Morris did not play drums like a standard rock drummer. His patterns were hard, strange, and built around toms instead of simple backbeat comfort. Severin's bass carried melody. McGeoch's guitar cut across the songs rather than decorating them. Nobody sounded like they were trying to impress a pub full of old rock fans. That suited Siouxsie perfectly. She did not want the Banshees to sound warm. She did not want them to sound skilled in the usual way. She wanted them tense, sharp, and difficult to file. In 1978, Polydor released Hong Kong Garden as the band's debut single. For a first hit, it was Strange Bait. The song had a bright, darting energy. But Siouxsie did not sing like someone trying to charm the radio. She sounded sharp, cold, and completely in command, turning a pop single into something with a threat hiding underneath. It hit number 7 in Britain. Less than 2 years after that no-song performance at the 100 Club, Siouxsie had a top 10 single. Then came The Scream, with Jigsaw Feeling, Metal Postcard, and Suburban Relapse. The album proved this was not just punk theater. It was a new language, drums like warning shots, bass like a shadow, guitar like broken glass, and Siouxsie standing in the middle of it, severe and certain. Success did not make her easier. It made her harder to argue with. That is where the trouble deepened. Every chart position, every review, every musician who listened closely gave Siouxsie more evidence that her instincts were right. If someone complained about the pressure, she had an answer. The sound worked. The records worked. So why should she soften? Chapter 4. The First Musicians, the Machine Spat Out. Before the Banshees became famous for losing people, they had already started shedding them. Sid Vicious was first. He had been there for the 100 Club chaos, hammering behind Siouxsie during the Lord's Prayer. But he was never going to be a permanent Banshee. He left and became part of the Sex Pistols' tragic legend. Marco Pirroni was next. He played guitar at that first show, then moved on. Later, with Adam and the Ants, he found a different kind of pop success, with songs like Stand and Deliver. Then came Peter Fenton. Fenton matters because he shows what Siouxsie would not tolerate. He was one of the early guitarists who tried to bring more normal rock playing into the band. The problem was not that he lacked ability. The problem was that his ability pointed in the wrong direction. Siouxsie did not want flash. She did not want some guitarist pulling the Banshees back toward familiar rock habits. The story that followed the band is perfect, whether polished by legend or not. Fenton launched into a solo Siouxsie hated, and she walked over and unplugged him in front of the crowd. Cruel? Maybe. Clear? Absolutely. She was telling every musician after him the same thing. Your talent only matters if it serves the world I am building. Sid was gone. Pirroni was gone. Fenton was gone. McKay and Morris stayed longer because they helped make the Scream sound dangerous. With Jigsaw Feeling and Metal Postcard, they gave Siouxsie the sharpness she wanted. But staying close to that vision came with a cost. And in 1979, even they reached their limit. Chapter 5. Aberdeen, the night her band split in half. The Join Hands tour should have proved Siouxsie and the Banshees could survive success. Instead, it proved how hard it was to survive Siouxsie. The album was darker and heavier than The Scream. Songs like Icon, Playground Twist, and Premature Burial did not sound like a band chasing another Hong Kong Garden. They sounded like Siouxsie pushing deeper into dread, control, and ritual, even if that made the band less comfortable to be inside. By September of 1979, the tension had become physical. In Aberdeen, Scotland, John McGeoch and Kenny Morris were on one side. Siouxsie and Stephen Severin were on the other. The band still had shows to play. Fans were waiting. The tour machine was moving. Then McGeoch and Morris left. Not at the end of the tour. Not after a neat little meeting. They walked out while dates were still booked and the band still needed a guitarist and drummer. That should have killed the Banshees. Siouxsie would not let it. This is where you see both sides of her. On one hand, she refused to collapse. She did not cancel the identity of the band because two men had reached their breaking point. On the other hand, she did not seem interested in stopping to ask what kind of machine made people flee in the middle of a tour. She protected the name. The Cure were opening for them, so Robert Smith stepped in on guitar. Budgie, who had played with the Slits, came in on drums. The Banshees survived a disaster that should have ended them. But something changed after Aberdeen. From then on, joining the Banshees meant accepting the warning. Siouxsie could make you part of something brilliant, but she could also make you feel replaceable the moment you could no longer bear the pressure. Robert Smith would learn that. Budgie would live inside it, and the next guitarist would create some of the band's greatest music before becoming another casualty of the machine. Chapter 6. John McGeoch and the Beautiful Damage. After Aberdeen, Siouxsie did not just need another guitarist. She needed proof that losing McKay and Morris had not weakened her. John McGeoch gave her that proof. He had already played with Magazine, and he was not the kind of guitarist Siouxsie usually rejected. He did not swagger all over the songs. He did not play like a man trying to win a solo contest. His guitar shimmered, sliced, vanished, and came back like a blade underwater. That was exactly what Siouxsie wanted. With McGeoch on guitar and Budgie now on drums, the Banshees entered one of their greatest periods. Kaleidoscope arrived in 1980, with Happy House and Christine proving the band could survive a public collapse and come back sharper. Then came Juju in 1981. With Spellbound and Arabian Nights, the Banshees sounded colder, darker, and more hypnotic than ever. McGeoch gave Siouxsie the atmosphere she demanded. Budgie gave her force. Severin gave her the strange melodic floor beneath everything. And Siouxsie stood in the middle, not just singing, but controlling the emotional temperature of the band. This is where her control looked brilliant. Every departure became evidence in her favor. Someone left, the band changed, and the next record still worked. If musicians complained, Siouxsie could point to the results. The results were real. In 1982, A Kiss in the Dream House pushed them even further, with Slow Dive and Melt. The music grew more lush and unstable, but McGeoch was coming apart. The touring was grinding him down. His drinking was worsening. In Madrid, he was in such bad shape that the band could not ignore it anymore. This is where Siouxsie's greatness starts to look cold. She knew McGeoch's talent. She used it beautifully. But when he could no longer function inside the Banshees, she did not rebuild the band around his recovery. She protected the machine. The standard came first. So one of the greatest guitarists she ever had became another name on the list. And when Siouxsie needed someone else, she reached back to the man who had already saved her once. Robert Smith came back. Chapter 7. Robert Smith enters the machine again. Robert Smith already knew the warning signs. He had been there after Aberdeen, when McKay and Morris walked out and left the Banshees exposed. He had seen Siouxsie and Severin run the operation from the inside. He had felt how exciting the band could be, and how little room it left for weakness. Then he came back anyway. After McGeoch was out, Smith became a full member while still leading The Cure. That alone tells you how powerful Siouxsie's pull was. The Cure were not waiting quietly in the background. Smith had his own band, his own songs, his own pressure, and his own world to carry. But Siouxsie wanted him. So he entered the machine again. In 1983, the Banshees released Dear Prudence, their cover of the Beatles' song. It became one of their biggest British hits, reaching number 3 in the United Kingdom. Robert Smith was on guitar, and for a moment, the match looked perfect. Then came Hyena in 1984 with Swimming Horses and Dazzle. The record had beauty in it, but Smith was being pulled apart behind the scenes. He was working inside the Banshees while also carrying The Cure, and the schedule was punishing. Siouxsie did not see that as a reason to stop. The dates mattered, the work mattered, the band mattered. If someone accepted the role, she expected that person to deliver, even if that person was Robert Smith. Smith eventually left, citing strain and exhaustion. Siouxsie took it personally. From her side, the tour was booked and the commitment had been made. From his side, the machine was asking too much. That is the brutal part of her leadership. She could inspire people to reach excellence, but when the work finally became impossible, she often treated human frailty as a betrayal. That sentence explains the Banshees better than almost anything. Siouxsie pulled greatness out of musicians because she refused to accept ordinary work. But when those musicians cracked, hesitated, drank too much, burned out, or needed space, her instinct was not always mercy. Her instinct was survival. Smith escaped back to The Cure and became one of alternative music's defining figures. The Banshees moved on again, but the list was getting longer. Sid Vicious, Marco Pirroni, Peter Fenton, John McKay, Kenny Morris, John McGeoch, Robert Smith, and somehow, Siouxsie was not finished. America had not even caught up yet. Chapter 8. America notices too late. After Robert Smith left, Siouxsie brought in John Valentine Carruthers from Clock DVA. By then, replacement had almost become part of the Banshees' identity. Lose a guitarist, change the chemistry, make another record, keep moving. Siouxsie could not afford to look wounded by every exit, so she turned exits into eras. In 1986, Tinderbox gave them Cities in Dust, one of their most important American breakthroughs. The song was about Pompeii, so even when the Banshees wrote something catchy, Siouxsie still made it sound like disaster was dancing under the floor. Carruthers lasted longer than some, but by 1987, he was gone too. Then came John Klein on guitar, and Martin McCarrick on cello, keyboards, and other instruments. This version of the band had more color and texture. In 1988, Peep Show gave them Peekaboo, a major alternative hit in America. That song shows how far Siouxsie had dragged the band from ordinary punk. Peekaboo sounded like a carnival tape playing backward in a haunted room. Strange rhythms, cut-up textures, and Siouxsie's voice teasing and threatening at the same time. It was weird, but it worked. Then, in 1991, Kiss Them For Me from Superstition gave the Banshees their biggest American pop moment. After years of being too strange for easy marketing, they finally had a song that crossed over. That should have felt like victory. Instead, it came too late. By the time America understood them, the band had already spent more than a decade burning through lineups, pressure, resentment, and exhaustion. The public saw reinvention. Inside the band, reinvention often meant someone had been pushed out, worn down, or replaced. And now the biggest pressure was not musical, it was personal. Because Siouxsie and Budgie were no longer just singer and drummer, they were a couple. Chapter 9. The marriage inside the band. Budgie was not another temporary Banshee. He stayed. After Kenny Morris left during the Join Hands disaster, Budgie came in and became essential. His drumming gave Siouxsie the force she needed. Explosive, sharp, tribal, and precise. He was one of the rare musicians who could fit her world without getting swallowed immediately. Then his role changed. Siouxsie and Budgie became a couple, and they formed The Creatures, a side project built around voice and drums. That gave Siouxsie a creative world outside the Banshees, one where Steven Severin was no longer the other half of the center. That mattered. Severin had been there from the first chaos at the 100 Club. He was the co-founder, the bass player, the person who helped build the Banshees' identity before there were records, hits, or mythology. Now the singer and drummer had their own private creative partnership. In May of 1991, Siouxsie and Budgie married. That was the same year Kiss Them For Me gave the Banshees their biggest American pop success. Outside the band, the world was finally catching up. Inside the band, the balance was shifting. This is where Siouxsie's control became harder to separate from her personal life. Budgie was her drummer, her husband, and her partner in The Creatures. Severin was still the co-founder, but the emotional center had moved. He was not just sharing a band anymore. He was watching the band he helped create become wrapped around a marriage. That kind of wound does not always explode at once. It shows up in writing sessions, in decisions, in who gets heard first, in who feels like a partner, and who starts feeling like an employee inside his own history. By the Rapture era, John Klein was gone. Knox Chandler had come in, and the band had reset again. But this time, Siouxsie could not turn the reset into another peak. The machine was running out of road. Chapter 10. The label walks away. In 1995, Siouxsie and the Banshees released The Rapture. It was their 11th studio album. 11 albums from a band that started with no songs at the 100 Club. 11 albums after Sid Vicious, Marco Pirroni, Peter Fenton, John McKay, Kenny Morris, John McGeoch, Robert Smith, John Carruthers, and John Klein had all moved through the story. By then, they had made Hong Kong Garden, Happy House, Christine, Spellbound, Arabian Nights, Dear Prudence, Cities in Dust, Peekaboo, and Kiss Them For Me. That is not a small catalog. That is a body of work that changed alternative music. And then Polydor dropped them. For Siouxsie, that was more than a business blow. Polydor had been there since the breakthrough. The label had watched the band survive walkouts, breakdowns, and reinventions. It had watched younger artists absorb what the Banshees built. But labels do not reward mythology forever. They reward momentum. By the mid-90s, the alternative world Siouxsie helped shape had moved into the mainstream, and younger bands were selling darkness in easier packages. The Banshees were no longer the future. They were one of the reasons the future existed. Siouxsie later pointed to Polydor and internal problems when explaining the end. Both mattered. The label gave up, but the band had already made survival harder than it had to be. Every exit was survived, but not erased. Every replacement worked, until it did not. Every new version carried the ghosts of the old one. And Siouxsie's control, the same force that protected the Banshees from becoming ordinary, had also made it difficult for the band to breathe. In April of 1996, Siouxsie and the Banshees broke up. No plane crash, no single scandal, just 20 years of pressure finally becoming heavier than the name. But even broken bands can reunite. The Banshees tried, and the old fight came back with them. Chapter 11, The Survivors, The Silence, and Siouxsie Now. In 2002, Siouxsie, Steven Severin, Budgie, and Knox Chandler reunited for the 7-year Itch Tour. On paper, it looked like a victory lap. The band had survived punk, post-punk, goth, alternative rock, label confusion, and a revolving door of musicians. Fans had another chance to see the name on stage, but a reunion does not erase the reason a band broke. Siouxsie wanted to dig deeper into the catalog. Severin wanted a more straightforward set built around songs people knew. That sounds like a small disagreement until you see what it really means. Who gets to decide what the Banshees are? For Siouxsie, the answer had always been obvious. She did. That answer made the band powerful. It also made peace almost impossible. The later years were full of ghosts. John McGeoch, the guitarist who helped shape Happy House, Spellbound, and Arabian Nights, died in 2004 at only 48. Kenny Morris, the drummer from The Scream and the man who left during the Aberdeen disaster, died in 2026 at 68. Siouxsie and Budgie's marriage also ended. In 2007, they announced their divorce, closing one of the most important personal and musical partnerships in the story. Siouxsie then stepped away for long stretches. Her solo album Manta Ray arrived in 2007. In 2013, she performed at Yoko Ono's Meltdown Festival in London. After that came another long silence. Then, in 2023, she returned to the stage. Not as Siouxsie and the Banshees, as Siouxsie. That detail matters. The band that carried her name and swallowed so many musicians was gone. Some members had died. Some relationships had broken. Some wounds had cooled without becoming simple. But Siouxsie Sue was still alive. Still iconic, still difficult, still tied to a sound younger artists keep rediscovering. That is the final contradiction. She made the Banshees impossible to ignore. She also helped make them almost impossible to survive.
So did Siouxsie Sue destroy her band?
Not by failing. That would be too easy. She did it by being right too often, too early, and too completely. She knew what the Banshees should sound like before the music world had a clean name for it. She rejected players who made the band ordinary. She pushed the ones who stayed into stranger places. For a long time, the results defended her. The hits were real. The influence was real. So was the wreckage. The Banshees did not collapse because Siouxsie lacked vision. They collapsed because her vision left very little room for anyone else to be fragile, wrong, tired, proud, or human. She needed brilliant musicians to bring her world to life. Then she controlled that world so tightly that many of them had to escape it. If you want more stories about the artists who changed music and paid for it, subscribe. Let's drop the needle.